Thank you to the organisers for the invitation. It's a lovely invitation. And for a long time, it seemed like a really great idea to come to this conference, to talk to nice people, to be back in Hungary and Budapest, to escape my country. I won't go on about it, but this may be the last chance I ever have to escape my country. But then I discovered that the conference was going to be full of people who do things and know things, at which point it gets incredibly intimidating. And I realized what a smart idea it was to have said I was only going to pose questions. So this is the no answers introduction. I'm pretty clear that I think there are important, difficult conversations to be had around a whole cluster of issues that this program has been associated with. And I hope to engage in some conversations about them. But definitely no answers. But just before I begin, I want to say how nice it is to be back associated with Olive again. Olive has been the source of some of my pleasures on my occasional visits to Budapest and to CEU. So thank you. So I want to.
It's not turned on.
It's all right. I'm an old person, but I can do arrows. Just about. I can just about do arrows. So there are 4 questions that I want to whiz through. And Ian's going to stop me after. He's going to tell me after 30 minutes. Honesty is.
It now works.
Fine. But I want to start here. And I want to start here because the question about transforming the university needs to be appropriate to the moment in which we are living and struggling. This is not a question about the university in the abstract. This is not the university as it used to be known, loved and or hated in the good old days. This is not the university as the simple elite institution that generates valuable knowledge and reproduces elites for the future. This is not that university anymore. I don't mean there are not traces of that university, because there are, but the university is already the site of massive, massive pressures to change. And unless we think about them thinking about the work of transforming the university still further, will elude us. That was a bit dogmatic, wasn't it? It'll get better, probably. But I was in London recently to see friends, family, and I walked about a mile and a half through central London. And the mile and a half was a sort of building site. And I asked one of the friends that I went for a drink with, why is all this fairly old bit of London being so overrun by building sites? And he said it's universities. It's universities. It's think of the sequence of them. It's University College London. It's the London School of Economics and Political Science. And it's King's College London. All of whom are engaged in massive, enormous property development. They are building sites. They have massive property portfolios. They are buying up bits of central London and transforming them into what you'd have to describe as the most corporate and corporately badged universities you can imagine. And that, I mean, they sit at a particular position in the competitive hierarchy of universities. They are world-ranked, prestigious, internationally disposed organisations, but they are part of a move, certainly in the UK, certainly in parts of the United States of America, which is about the financialisation of the university. So the people who really matter in such universities are the people who can understand finance. I mean, they might have professors, they might have chief executive officers or vice chancellors, as we used to call them, but actually the people who matter are the people who can understand their property portfolio, who can understand how to package and sell student debt, the people who can imagine future transactions and future student income and transform them into portfolios. And they are the magic men and women of the modern university. I am an old person, but one of the things that strikes me is that such people had not even been imagined when I went to university. That's a significant transformation. Can you read that? Yeah. It's my eyes then. So, commodification, education increasingly exists as a purchasable commodity, purchasable by different sorts of people, domestic students who mortgage their futures by accumulating debt or have very rich parents, international students who can bring a dowry with them to keep universities afloat. It's a slightly strange commodity because increasingly for larger and larger proportions of students, it's a commodity that fails to have use value. Sorry, that's a bit of old-fashioned Marxism. It turns out that the promise of university education does not deliver. The proportion of graduate students going into non-graduate jobs or into no jobs at all is increasing. Metricization. I just borrowed this from a friend of mine who invented it, I think, but it's what Ian was saying about the calculation of universities to produce reputation. Where do they stand in the global university rankings? Where do they stand in the research excellence rankings? Where do they stand in the student satisfaction rankings? Where do they stand in the property empires that they are required to build? And so on. So the university has become countable. And quite often countable in unimaginable, inappropriate, and really perverse ways. I'm not going to say more about it because it sounds like, and there is a danger in this, of old whining academics saying how tough life has become. You shouldn't worry about us too much. There are people in worse positions than sad, oppressed academics. But it is a powerful transformation of the university, and it means that people who can count occupy, or at least people who can count certain sorts of things, occupy increasingly powerful positions. Don't get me started on accountants. And more, and more, and more. Global competition, English universities have outposts everywhere. It is the equivalent of reinventing the British Empire. It's not quite that the map is painted red, but most of the major English universities have branch offices in Dubai, Beijing, Singapore, and. Because we are global. We are imperial, but we don't say that anymore. We are now global. And that matters. It matters that University College London can say, we are the number one. And LSE can say, we are number two, but we try harder. And. So that process of enlarging the reach of the university, I'll come back to later, but it's important. And all of that is about value. all of that is about not just having value, but being able to demonstrate it. And that means it's very particular sorts of value. And only some sort of activities are valued. And by and large, most of the business of the university that goes on in small spaces is not valued unless it can be countered. Encounters with students are not much valued except in that strange end of year or end of semester consumer survey exercise in which student views are collected. Would you give this person 10 out of 10? 9.5 out of 10? 8? A measly 3? They are such a strange exercise. It's like the TripAdvisor for university teachers. Right? And indeed, the United States of America, of course, as a class leader in these things, has a TripAdvisor for universities called Rate My Professor. And I occasionally go and look up my friends. As you do, it's like TripAdvisor, isn't it? You always want to know if there's somebody who hates somebody you know. And it turns out, of course, that there are. That there are. And you will not be surprised to hear, as with many such social technologies, that the United States right-wing student population has mobilized. This is a lesbian, anti-Christian teacher. 0. It happens. But as a consequence, value then becomes mutated into, does it deliver careers? What are the employment destinations of the students from this program? Does it deliver the, I have to underline corporate success. Universities now think they are corporations. They are managed as if they are corporations. Does it deliver corporate success? So before I retired, and I will at several points say in a rather smug, sanctimonious way, I'm retired. Sorry, I just banged my microphone. I am retired. I am no longer subject to some of these disciplinary processes. But before I retired, I had to complete an annual survey in which I explained how my own objectives for the year aligned with the corporate objectives of the university. Yeah, right. For the last 3 years, my estimate was it would take them longer to dismiss me than I had to go before retirement. So I said, I have no idea. Anyway, we won't get onto my personal heroism. But that sense of alignment for the university is a powerful one, which is if you are not delivering, you are not of value to us. And then, of course, it's about national success. My Prime Minister, God, can you imagine having to stand up in a public place and describe the people who claim to run my country as my government and my Prime Minister? This is one of the most embarrassing, difficult things imaginable. My Prime Minister said, 3 years ago, celebrating the possibilities of Brexit, we are one of the world leaders in education. Right? This is what we deliver. We deliver international competitive success for the United Kingdom. Well, actually for England, because Scotland's different. We try not to talk about them. But we also then occasionally are subject to other pressures and demands. One of which is about demonstrating public value. And that has included what you might call a sort of subset of themes about value, about access, so widening participation, the inclusion of those poor people who aren't really good enough to come to university, but we ought to have a few of them. And that's the sort of site of constant comings and goings between universities and funders. But it adds a sense of strain to the value, because of course universities want people who are. I was once an examiner at a university which said, well, we only recruit excellent students, and that means that we only issue them with excellent degrees. It was barely worth having examinations or essay writing, because we knew, because we'd recruited the brightest and the best, that they would be first-class students when they exited. And that university had a lot of trouble because it created a widening access program in which it recruited poorer, older, more female students who turned out not to be first-class students. And they didn't know what to do with them, because they shouldn't have such students. And it causes strains within the funding arrangements and within the universities. As well as, of course, all the leftovers, all the hierarchies, all the traditions. This is how we do things here. I was talking to Ian about Oxford and Cambridge earlier, and they believe that they are immune to such things, partly because they're world class to start with, partly because they only deal in excellence, so they've always been that sort of people. But they try not to count things because they're bigger and better than that. They don't have lots of poor people either. But that means the university as a place, as an organisation, as an institution, is the site of all sorts of strains, tensions, contradictions, antagonisms. Students sometimes hate being treated as consumers. I remember student representatives standing up at the Senate of my university saying, could you stop calling us customers? We think we are members of an academic community. And my then Vice-Chancellor looked deeply puzzled. But why would you think that? But sometimes consumer rights give you leverage and pressure on intransigent academics and institutions. And wherever you touch it, academics are grumpy, bad-tempered, miserable, hate filling in forms, hate accountants, hate being told that they are on increasingly short contracts, because of course it becomes institutionally easier to manage the corporate enterprise if you don't have your wage structure tied down by people on permanent contracts. And. So, the place is fraught, at best. And it's fraught in a way that generates insane grand schemes. That's Irfan, who's woken up. It's mentioning grand schemes that does it. The grand schemes of governments, of chief executives, of research managers, and more, and the increasing sense that this is not working. And especially it's not working for its supposed beneficiaries. So it's just to say, if we are going to talk about transforming the university, we are talking about transforming a place that is already a mess, subject to different sorts of pressures. And the Open Learning Initiative, I still think Olive is nicer, but reminded me about the peculiarities of openness. I worked for, dear God, 34 years at a place called the Open University in the United Kingdom. And it was forever having anxiety-ridden discussions about what it meant to be open. So I'm just going to briefly would be good, wouldn't it? Briefly summarize those. When I arrived there, we existed in a state of what you might call largely relaxed, happy contentment about being open. We knew that we were better than everybody else because we did not select students. I can't tell you what a source of pleasure it was to turn up somewhere and not have to go through that insane process where you review their profile, you do interviews, and you say, is this a worthy person for our institution, or should they go to somewhere scummier down the road? Right? I've spent 34 years without selecting a student. It was fabulous. It was brilliant. So, and we were entirely smug, self-satisfied and content with this experience, which is, we're open. Hey, anybody can do this. Anybody who wants to come can come. Yes, and every now and then we would have a tremor of self-doubt, particularly when the details of recruitment came for people who were black or from minority ethnic backgrounds. And the Open University recruited significantly less than the national proportion of black and minority ethnic people. Hey, it's their choice. They don't want to come, it's okay. And so, but it did eventually provoke a discussion which said, why might that be? Why does this not look like a place that such people might want to come to? And we did one small, we're academics, so we did one small exercise and we looked at the imagery that the university provided. It's 1986. The imagery that that our university provided in which people who were black might recognize themselves. And in all our public-facing material, we were able to find one image which included black people. It was a photograph of 3 young African Caribbean men trashing a telephone box. I'd just like to say that I really would like to say that this caused some embarrassment. It did in some quarters. But it was a moment of why? How did you, what? So, of course, we set out to generate more positive images. It didn't make much difference to the recruitment figures, but it did start what was a discussion that was still going on by the time I left 30 years later, which is, how do you generate an institution in which people might imagine themselves, in which people might recognize themselves, in which people might think that they could be part of it, as opposed to somebody who, as Ian rightly says, looks like me. Huh? I know what universities were created for. They were created for people who look, what was that word you used? Normal. And one of my favorite Canadian singer-songwriters, a man called Bruce Cockburn, has a wonderful song called The Trouble with Normal. And it includes the remarkable phrase, the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. And if you want to see the trouble with normal, this is my self-shame. I am the most frightening embodiment you can find in the world at the moment. The angriest and most dangerous people are older white men. Do not have anything to do with us. It's not good. It's not smart. You should avoid us at all possible moments. I think we're scary. The question is, Can you move to a more active model of openness, which is one which seeks to recreate the membership of this intellectual community? Can we collectively create a space which says, yeah, actually, you belong here, you belong here, you belong here, yeah, you belong here too, yes, certainly you belong here. Try not to notice who I am, but you belong here. And that, like so many other struggles at the moment, is about challenging barriers. Barriers to access are potent. It's about challenging borders of various sorts, but particularly national borders. If you are a non-EU student in the United Kingdom, you become subject to extra surveillance because mainly my government thinks that you should not be there. You are definitely out of place. If you are, there was one wonderful draft piece of government guidance in the 1990s which invited teachers and academics to report on Asian-looking students. I mean, they can't even write English, right? You can either report on Asian students or you can report on Muslim students, but Asian, what's Asian looking? Right? Anyway, but a culture and climate of antagonism and suspicion is not one in which people are likely to feel welcome, to recognize themselves. So there are material and affective barriers to engagement and to participation. And there are systematic, structured exclusions, right? Let us not think that organizations like universities operate without a mental imagery of who they would like to see in their place. Because they do. Because they do. I'm going to come back to questions about access in the next slide. But I just want to say one thing about universities as places and spaces. And this is because this way you get to join in an argument that I have at home with my partner who has been writing about transforming universities. So I'm sorry, this is like a private conversation made semi-public. And she was saying there's this really interesting stuff going on at the moment in the universities about opening the university to make them more engaged in their local communities, to break the boundaries where the university is a separate place from the place in which it sits. There's community engagement, community participation, social justice programs, outreach work. A friend of mine is involved in legal advice clinics run by law students in the local, and wonderful things. And I said, but that's the university as a place, in a place. That's the university and a local community. And the local community may or may not be complicated, may or may not be multi-ethnic, may or may not be riven with divisions and complications, but it's still predominantly local. And I think that the contemporary English university has a double face, which is it's discovered the local, or some of them, let me not get overexcited, have discovered the community and are if I do that gesture, it looks a bit dramatic, as though they're ripping apart the walls and opening space. It's more of a, we could open this one back door and hope that nobody notices sort of opening. Simultaneously with massive selective internationalization. So they are very good at crossing barriers and borders and boundaries. But selectively. We can cope with people of colour as long as they are very rich. As long as they bring their dowry. Others, less so. But working at the Up University required me to think about university not quite so much as a place, because we weren't a place. We were a national distance teaching institution. So there is a question about what universities as a space might mean. A space of relationships, of connections and disconnections and exclusions. But I just think it's important to keep those two dimensions in play. How long have I got?
10 minutes. You want to have a conversation with your audience?
No, sod them. I'm enjoying this much too much. All right, faster. It's going backwards. That's better. Okay. Well, this turns out to be easy because that's what the rest of the 2 days is all about. So, what is it that we might be engaged in struggles about? As the invitation came, I realized that I was involved in conversations with people about very different sorts of things. One is what I was talking about before, which is how do we democratize, enlarge, enhance access to the university? I think that remains an absolutely critical struggle, and there are different strategies for doing so. That's access within and beyond national boundaries. And I think certainly in the UK, we have historically concentrated on within. How do you get the underrepresented into the university? I think one of the great things about Olive and the connected programs is it shifts that conversation decisively. So, but it leaves open the anxiously echoing question, which is access to what? Is it just access to what the university is or used to be? Is it access to all those internal exclusions, hierarchies, structures of power, structures of authority, in which, and Ian is entirely right, sad old white men get to stand up and harangue you for what is now probably feeling like hours on end, really. There will be another day. There's stuff to look forward to. Do we engage in transformative struggles over what counts as knowledge? That's a struggle that is already going on, especially around how to decolonize the curriculum. I can't even begin the conversation about that, but my word, I thought we read Dead Old White Men when I went to university in 1968. And it turns out that by and large we still read Dead Old White Men. And not just the content of the knowledge, but the form in which it operates. The disciplinary regimes and structures which organize and say, this is the only way you can know about things. And then in terms of who gets to tell you about it, and the forms of authority that they look at. This is just too embarrassing for words. I'm it. Well, I'm as sad as you can get. And yet, happily, as powerful as you can get. Untransformed. Then there are questions about how to democratize pedagogy, which is the intersection of the knowledge question and the question about how people might learn. And indeed, how, can you imagine how even old, authoritative, powerful people might learn? I've just finished a book which is about conversations with people, which begins with the claim that I have never had an original thought in my life. I remain wedded to this view that actually it is precisely through different forms of conversation with people that I have learned and come to know things. So I think there are questions about the pedagogical processes that are object of transformative work. And then there's the questions about the institutions themselves. Right? I mean, I won't go on about it, except to say, given what I was saying about what's valued in the institution, how do we change what the university as an institutional arrangement values? How do we shift how it thinks about valuing the work that people do, how it thinks about valuing different sorts of people, how it thinks about its processes and valorizations of who it recruits? How did I get to be where I am? I sort of looked right, really. And how one of the struggles is this tedious struggle. How do you change the norms and values that govern not just recruitment, but promotion? How do you promote people for, well, let's say, working with open learning programs rather than research excellence? How do you promote people for doing useful work rather than bringing in vast research grants? I've spent a long time on university promotions committees, and they are not easily persuaded that what they count as, in a Christian sense, good works is the same as promotable. So, lots of questions about how you democratize institutions, but those matter. And finally, I have throughout used the word we, as if all of us in this space share a common identity, purpose, commitment, and it is a word that has troubled me every time I hear it. It's a word that slides unspoken assumptions into public policies, into public discourse, into the everyday functioning of institutions. I used to work at a university that taught at a distance, mainly through video and written material. And I had a reputation as being the person who sat reading everybody's draft chapter saying, when you say we think this, who exactly do you think we are? Right? And it used to, you will not be surprised to hear, be me. Right? I am normal. And I used to say, well, perhaps not everybody was born in 1950, is white, male, and has had this set of knowledges. And they say, well, yes, but most people will. You know what we... and there's a wonderful social psychologist called Michael Billig who wrote a book called Banal Nationalism, which I love deeply. And Banal Nationalism says the word we is one of the ways in which the nation is signified in the most banal forms. It runs through public institutions. This is what we are for. This is who we are for. This is who we are. Through public policies. It is not a natural occurrence, but is involved in the making of a public. We are invited to recognize ourselves, or more precisely in some cases, to not recognize ourselves, to understand that we do not belong in this we, to realize that we are somebody else, with no rights, with no foothold, with no place. And that, I think, is how we circulates most of the time. You will not be surprised to hear, I said I wouldn't go on about the United Kingdom, you will not be surprised to hear that we are outraged. Actually, we're outraged almost constantly. And mainly, that's people like me. It's where I live. I recognize myself. I am in an area of white flight, of old white people, of old white men who sit around saying, I can't do this story, I haven't got time. They sit around saying things like, the Africans are coming. To which I say, when? And they say, what do you mean? And I say, is it worth me waiting? We live in a state of false terror and intense outrage, and it is entirely distressing and disconcerting. But the alternative is what Olive does, what other programs do, and what I think is absolutely critical, which is publics can be remade. Other we's are possible. Other we's can be brought into being, are brought into being. It's not just some fanciful, clever thought by an academic. It's that in everyday policies and practices, people bring other we's into existence. They build, and this is my one conceptual observation, in the preface to the contribution of the Critique of Political Economy, written in 1857 by Karl Marx, Marx talked about the importance of thinking about unities as unities in difference, of not a simple, one-dimensional we, but as a multiplicity, as a solidarity across difference. And it seems to me that, okay, that's the issue. It's one of the issues. It's vital. It's vital not just for these politics and policies. It is, I think, the struggle for life itself. Thank you very much.